When I saw my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, pointing at me and yelling at me to get out of the frame of the Christmas photo, I felt like my entire world had collapsed around me. It wasn't just the humiliation of being treated like an unwanted object in my own son's living room, but the way she said those words, with such venom and contempt, as if my mere presence were a contamination that ruined the perfect moment she was trying to capture for her social media. There I was, Margaret Wilson, 62, widowed for 3 years, holding a carefully wrapped gift that had taken weeks to find, standing in the entryway of a house I had helped furnish, being kicked out of the family photo on Christmas Day. My son David stood behind the professional camera Rebecca had insisted he buy, his eyes avoiding mine, his posture hunched like a defeated man. My grandchildren, Emma and Lucas, sat on the couch with confused and uncomfortable expressions, clearly not understanding why the grandmother they loved was being treated like an intruder. Rebecca's parents, Richard and Susan, stood proudly beside the Christmas tree, smiling with that superiority I had come to recognize over the years. Rebecca's sister, Sarah, was holding her infant son, and I could see a sly smile forming on her lips as she witnessed my humiliation. But what no one in that room knew was that I had arrived 15 minutes earlier than scheduled and had overheard a conversation through the half-open door that would reveal the truth behind years of manipulation, exclusion, and carefully constructed lies. What happened that night not only changed the course of my life and the lives of my family, but exposed a web of financial and emotional manipulation so deep that to this day I wonder how I hadn't seen the signs much earlier. If you're listening to me now, you probably know the pain of loving people who sometimes don't reciprocate that love the way you deserve, right? Here on this channel, you'll find a safe space where real stories like mine are heard, where we can reflect together on the complexities of family relationships without judgment or shame. These stories will deeply move you, make you reflect on your own experiences, and perhaps even help you recognize patterns you hadn't noticed in your own life. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community where every story matters, where every experience is validated, and where you'll always be welcome exactly as you are. Now let me tell you all the details of how this whole situation began, how it unfolded over 5 years, and how it finally reached that breakthrough moment on Christmas that would change everything forever. My name is Margaret Wilson, I'm 62 years old, and I've lived in a quiet suburb of Seattle for over 30 years. I'm a retired elementary school teacher, a profession I loved deeply for 35 years before retiring at 60. My husband, Thomas, passed away 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack at the age of 65, leaving a void in my life that still aches when I think of him. Thomas was a civil engineer, a hard-working and dedicated man who built a comfortable life for our family. We had only one son, David, who is now 35 and works as a software engineer at a technology company in Seattle. We've always been a small but close-knit family, or at least I thought we were. David was always a sweet and sensitive child, the kind of boy who cried when he saw injured animals and always defended younger children on the playground. He was brilliant academically, graduated with honors in computer science from the University of Washington, and landed a top-notch job right after graduation. As a mother, I was incredibly proud of him, not only for his academic and professional achievements, but for the kind and ethical person he had become. Thomas and I raised David with strong values about family, honesty, and loyalty, values I believed were deeply ingrained in him. David met Rebecca Carter at a tech conference 6 years ago. Rebecca was 28 at the time, working as a marketing manager for a tech startup, and was undeniably beautiful and charismatic. When David first brought her to meet Thomas and me, I was struck by her confidence and eloquence. She spoke passionately about her career, had strong opinions on everything, and seemed genuinely interested in meeting David's family. Thomas, always more skeptical than I, commented later that night that Rebecca seemed a bit too intense, a bit controlling in the way she directed every conversation, but I told him to give her a chance. After all, David was clearly smitten, and who was I to judge my son's choice? Their courtship was relatively short, only 8 months before David announced they were engaged. I was surprised by how quickly it had happened, but David assured me that Rebecca was the one, that he had never felt so certain about anything in his life. Rebecca's family was from Portland, Oregon. Her father, Richard, owned a small accounting firm, and her mother, Susan, was a social worker. They had 2 daughters, Rebecca and her younger sister, Sarah, who was 24 at the time and worked as an administrative assistant. When I first met Rebecca's parents at a dinner to discuss wedding plans, I immediately realized where Rebecca got her dominant personality. Susan talked incessantly about how her family did things, about Carter traditions, about how important it was for the wedding to reflect their family values. Richard was quieter, but when he did speak, it was always to support everything Susan said. I tried to contribute some wedding ideas, mentioning our Wilson family traditions, but Susan basically dismissed every suggestion, saying she had better or more modern ideas. The wedding was planned for a year after their engagement, at an elegant boutique hotel outside Seattle. Rebecca wanted a large, elaborate ceremony with 200 guests, most of them friends and colleagues of hers and her family. David seemed a bit overwhelmed by all the planning, but Rebecca took control of every detail. She chose the venue, the menu, the flowers, the music, all without really asking David's opinion. When I gently suggested that perhaps David should have more input, Rebecca smiled and said David was too busy with work and that she was happy to take care of everything. The cost of the wedding quickly escalated to $70,000. Rebecca and David were paying the bulk of it, but there was an implicit expectation that both her family and ours would contribute substantially. Rebecca's parents contributed $15,000. Thomas and I discussed at length how much we could contribute without jeopardizing our retirement. Thomas was about to retire, and we needed to be careful with our finances. We decided to contribute $10,000, a significant amount for us, but one we felt was appropriate for our only child's wedding. When I presented the check to Rebecca and David, David seemed genuinely grateful and a little embarrassed to accept so much money. Rebecca, on the other hand, looked at the check with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, somewhere between disappointment and calculation. She politely thanked him but casually mentioned that her parents had contributed $15,000 despite having 2 daughters to marry off, while we only had David. The comment was said with a smile, but the implication was clear: we should have given more. This was the first of many moments when I felt like nothing I did would ever be enough for Rebecca. The wedding itself was beautiful, I must admit. Rebecca looked stunning in a wedding dress that cost $8,000 alone. David was radiant with happiness. During the ceremony, I looked at Thomas and saw tears in his eyes as he watched our son get married. In that moment, I decided to put aside my small reservations about Rebecca and simply rejoice in my son's happiness. After all, what mattered was that David was happy, right? I didn't yet know that this would be one of the last truly happy moments I would have with my family intact for years to come. At the reception, I noticed how Rebecca had arranged the seating so that my family was at tables farther from the main stage, while hers was all at the tables up front. During the speeches, Rebecca's parents spoke at length about how lucky they were to welcome David into their family, but when it was my turn to speak as the groom's mother, Rebecca had arranged the schedule so tightly that I only had 3 minutes before the music started again. My speech, which I had spent weeks preparing, had to be drastically cut short, and I left the stage feeling like my contribution had been an afterthought. Thomas noticed these little things too, and later that night in our hotel room, he expressed his concerns more openly. He said Rebecca seemed like the type of person who needed to control everything and everyone around her, and that he was worried about David. I defended Rebecca, saying she was just a stressed-out bride who wanted her day to be perfect, and that things would improve after the wedding when she wasn't so pressured. Thomas sighed and said he hoped I was right, but that we had to be vigilant to ensure David didn't lose his voice in the relationship. I never imagined how prophetic those words would be. The first 6 months of their marriage were relatively uneventful. Rebecca and David moved into an apartment in a trendy Seattle neighborhood, a 2-bedroom place that rented for $3,500 a month. I thought it was a lot of money for an apartment, especially considering they were trying to save up for a house, but Rebecca insisted that location was important for her professional image. She frequently mentioned how important it was to live in the right neighborhood, hang out in the right places, and be seen with the right people to advance her career. Rebecca called me occasionally during those first few months, usually to ask for recipe advice or to inquire about family traditions. I appreciated these calls, feeling like we were beginning to build a genuine relationship. She invited me to lunch a few times, and we had pleasant conversations about life, career, and family. Rebecca talked a lot about her professional ambitions, how she wanted to climb the corporate ladder, and her plans to eventually open her own marketing agency. She had big dreams and the determination to achieve them, qualities I admired, even if her intensity was sometimes a bit intimidating. It was during one of these lunches that Rebecca casually mentioned that she and David were trying to get pregnant. She said she wanted to have children while she was still young enough to regain her figure quickly and return to work without losing too much career momentum. The way she talked about pregnancy as a project to be managed efficiently, rather than a magical moment of creating life, made me a little uncomfortable. But again, I told myself it was just a pragmatic way of approaching things. 6 months after the wedding, Rebecca announced she was pregnant. David was beaming with joy, already talking about what it would be like to teach his son to play baseball or his daughter to ride a bike. Thomas and I were thrilled at the prospect of becoming grandparents. I immediately offered any help they needed, and Rebecca graciously accepted, saying she would certainly need the support, especially after returning to work. Rebecca's pregnancy was textbook perfect. She continued working out until 2 weeks before her due date, maintained her doctor-approved exercise routine, and documented every moment on social media with professionally styled photos. I threw her a baby shower, spending over $2,000 on decorations, food, and gifts. I invited all of her friends she requested, over 40 women. Rebecca seemed to appreciate the effort, but she made several comments during the event about how certain things could have been done differently or better. Still, I swallowed my wounded pride and focused on supporting my daughter-in-law during this important time. Emma was born on a rainy March afternoon, weighing 7 pounds and with a shocking head of dark hair. I stood in the hospital waiting room with Thomas, practically jumping with anticipation. When David finally came out and took us to see the baby, my heart burst with love. Rebecca was exhausted but triumphant, holding Emma like a trophy she'd won. When she asked if I wanted to hold my granddaughter, I held out my arms, tears streaming down my face. That perfect little being in my arms was a part of me, a continuation of our family, and I silently promised I would be the best grandmother she could ever have. Emma's first months were intense. Rebecca returned to work when Emma was just 6 weeks old, a decision that surprised me but which she defended, saying she couldn't afford to take too much time off if she wanted to keep her position. I immediately offered to care for Emma during the day, but Rebecca had already arranged for expensive daycare that cost $2,000 a month. She said studies showed that early socialization was beneficial for cognitive development, and that she preferred trained professionals caring for her daughter. I was a little hurt, but I understood it was her choice as a mother. Instead, I offered to babysit Emma on the weekends to give David and Rebecca some time to themselves. Rebecca accepted, and those weekends became the most precious moments for me. I loved every second with my granddaughter, singing lullabies, reading children's books, simply watching every expression on her perfect little face. Thomas was also a wonderful grandfather, making silly faces to make Emma smile, walking around the room with her when she was restless. Those were some of the last truly happy months Thomas had before his sudden death. Thomas died of a massive heart attack one Tuesday morning when Emma was 8 months old. He was in the garden, trimming the hedges, something he loved to do. I was inside preparing lunch when I heard a strange sound outside. When I went out to check, I found my husband of 40 years lying unresponsive on the ground. I called 911 immediately and tried to perform CPR as we had learned in a course years ago, but deep down, I knew. When the paramedics arrived and began working on him, I saw in their eyes that it was too late. Thomas was pronounced dead at the hospital less than an hour later. My world completely fell apart that day. David was devastated by his father's death. He cried in my arms like he hadn't cried since he was a child, and we supported each other through the unbearable grief. Rebecca was present at the funeral, of course, but there was something mechanical about the way she offered condolences, as if she were following a script of appropriate behavior rather than genuinely empathizing. She became impatient when David had to take a week off work to deal with his father's affairs and support his mother, commenting that a week was too long and that he needed to get back to his normal life. During those first weeks after Thomas's death, I was operating on autopilot, just trying to get through each day. David came to visit regularly, bringing Emma, and those moments with my son and granddaughter were the only light in my darkness. Rebecca rarely came along, always saying she had work or commitments she couldn't cancel. I began to notice that she seemed uncomfortable when David expressed a desire to spend time with me, making comments about how he needed to focus on his own family now, as if I were no longer part of that family. What I didn't know at the time was that Rebecca was actively working behind the scenes to ensure she had full control over any inheritance David received from his father. Thomas had been a careful planner. He had a life insurance policy through his work, plus an additional investment he had purchased years ago. The total value of the policy was $250,000, with David as the sole beneficiary. Thomas and I had discussed this years ago, and we agreed that David should be the beneficiary because I would still have our home, our retirement savings, and my teaching pension to support me comfortably. David received the insurance money approximately 6 weeks after Thomas's death. He called me to tell me, his voice thick with emotion, saying it felt wrong to receive money for his father's death, but that he was grateful for the careful planning Thomas had done. I agreed, saying his father would have been happy knowing he was financially secure. David mentioned that the amount was approximately $25,000, enough to pay off some debts and perhaps make some necessary improvements to their apartment. $25,000. That number stuck in my head because it seemed low compared to what I thought Thomas's policy was worth, but I figured maybe I was misremembering. I was in a fog of grief and wasn't thinking clearly about financial details. Besides, Thomas had always handled all our finances, and I wasn't familiar with the specifics of all his policies. So I accepted what David told me without question, never imagining that the number was a carefully constructed lie, a lie Rebecca had convinced my son to tell me. The truth, which I would only discover years later on that terrible Christmas day, was that David had actually received $250,000, not $25,000. Rebecca had immediately taken control of the situation when the check arrived. She convinced David that I didn't need to know the actual amount because it might make me uncomfortable or create expectations about financial help. She argued that it was better for their relationship to keep their finances private, including from his family. And David, still grieving and vulnerable, believed her and went along with the lie. With that money, Rebecca immediately set about executing her plans. She convinced David to use $50,000 as a down payment on a house in a more affluent Seattle suburb, a 4-bedroom house priced at $700,000. Another $50,000 went toward extensive renovations, transforming it into the magazine-worthy home Rebecca had always dreamed of. She opened investment accounts in David's name, but structured them so she had full access and control, claiming that as a marketing manager, she understood financial management better than he did. And the rest, well, the rest was gradually spent on things Rebecca wanted. Designer clothes, expensive handbags, cosmetic procedures, and luxurious trips she documented extensively on social media. But I didn't know any of this at the time. When David told me about the house purchase, I was genuinely happy for them. I offered to help with the move, to contribute furniture or decorations, but Rebecca quickly declined, saying she had a specific vision for the house and had already hired an interior designer. I wasn't consulted about anything related to the new house, not even about the neighborhood, which was a 40-minute drive from my house instead of the 15 minutes from my old apartment. Emma was just over a year old when they moved into their new home. I'd hoped to be invited to help with the move, or at least to see the house once they were settled, but weeks passed without any invitation. When I finally expressed a desire to see the new house, Rebecca scheduled a visit like a doctor's appointment, a Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock for exactly 2 hours. When I arrived and saw the house, I was impressed but also a little confused. It seemed far more expensive than what David and Rebecca could afford with their combined salaries and the supposed $25,000 inheritance. The house was beautifully decorated with expensive modern furniture, artwork on the walls, and professional landscaping in the garden. Rebecca gave me a proud tour, casually mentioning designers and brands I'd never heard of. When I commented that everything looked very expensive, Rebecca laughed and said they'd made some smart investments that were paying off handsomely, and that with David's growing salary as a senior software engineer, they could afford nice things. Something about the explanation struck me as vague, but then again, I didn't want to be the nosy mother-in-law questioning their finances. It was during that visit that Rebecca announced she was pregnant again. Emma wasn't even 2 yet, and I was surprised they were having another child so quickly. But Rebecca explained that she wanted to have her children close in age so they could grow as companions. David seemed a little overwhelmed by the news, but tried to be enthusiastic. I again offered any help they needed, especially now that they would have 2 young children, but Rebecca said she had everything under control. Lucas was born 11 months after that visit, a large, healthy baby weighing 9 pounds. This time, I wasn't called to the hospital until the next day, when Rebecca was rested and ready for visitors. When I arrived at the hospital room, I found Rebecca's family already there, holding the baby, taking pictures, completely dominating the space. I waited patiently, and when I finally held my grandson, I felt that same burst of love I'd felt with Emma. Lucas had his father's eyes, and my heart ached thinking how much Thomas would have loved to meet this grandson. In the first few months after Lucas was born, I repeatedly offered practical help. I knew how difficult it was to manage 2 small children, especially with Rebecca returning to work after only 6 weeks. I offered to pick Emma up from daycare, to go grocery shopping, to cook meals that could be easily frozen and reheated. But each offer was politely declined with various excuses. Rebecca had a system, she said. She had everything organized. She didn't want to be a bother. She preferred to handle things her own way. What was really happening, I realized much later, was that Rebecca had been systematically distancing me from my grandchildren from the very beginning. She saw my involvement as a threat to her control over the family. Every moment I spent with Emma and Lucas was a moment where I could observe things, ask questions, and potentially uncover the lies she was constructing. It was safer for her to keep me at a distance, gradually transforming me from an involved grandmother to an occasional visitor. Visits became more spaced out and more controlled. I used to see Emma and Lucas at least once a week, but gradually it became every 2 weeks, then once a month. When I called David to schedule a visit, he always said he had to check with Rebecca first, that he had to check their calendar. And often, when a visit was finally scheduled, it would be cancelled at the last minute with excuses about the kids being sick or last-minute commitments. It was also around this time that Rebecca began making subtle comments about my childcare methods. When I gave Emma a cookie for a snack, Rebecca would comment on how sugar caused hyperactivity and dental problems. When I let Lucas watch television for 20 minutes while I prepared his lunch, Rebecca would mention studies that screen time in young children harms brain development. When I read old books I'd saved from when David was a child, Rebecca would suggest that there were more modern, educationally appropriate books I should use. Each comment was delivered with a smile and a polite tone, as if she were simply sharing helpful information, but the cumulative effect was to make me feel incompetent and criticized. I began to feel anxious during visits, constantly worrying that I was doing something wrong, that Rebecca would disapprove of something I did. The spontaneous joy of being with my grandchildren was replaced by a constant tension of being judged and considered inadequate. David seemed oblivious to all of this. He worked long hours, often leaving home at 7 in the morning and not returning until after 8 at night. Rebecca constantly complained about his work hours, but at the same time encouraged him to take on more projects, seek promotions, and work harder to advance his career. She wanted the status and salary that came with higher positions, but she didn't want the absentee husband that inevitably resulted from such professional success. I tried repeatedly to talk to David about how I was feeling excluded from the children's lives, but he always downplayed my concerns. He said Rebecca was just stressed out juggling 2 young children and a demanding career. He said I was being overly sensitive, that I needed to be more understanding. He urged me to be patient, that things would improve when the children got older and less demanding. And I believed him because he was my son and because the alternative was to accept that something was fundamentally wrong in his relationship. The first major incident that should have been a clear warning sign was Emma's 5th birthday. Weeks earlier, I had offered to host a party at my house. It had a spacious backyard, perfect for children to run and play. I offered to pay for everything, the decorations, the food, the entertainment, everything. Emma loved princesses at the time, so I planned an elaborate themed party with a professional decorator that cost $1,500. I hired a clown that cost $400 for 2 hours. I ordered a custom cake from a bakery Rebecca had mentioned, costing $300. I bought party favors for each child invited, creating goodie bags with toys and candy that cost $20 each for 30 children. In total, I spent over $3,000 on that party because I wanted my granddaughter to have a magical day she would remember for the rest of her life. I spent weeks planning every detail, working with the decorator to create a princess wonderland in my backyard. There was a bouncy castle, an arts and crafts area where kids could decorate crowns, a children's makeup station, and even a dance floor with music from princess movies. 3 days before the party, Rebecca called and said we needed to discuss some adjustments. She came to my house with a notebook full of notes and began listing changes she wanted to make. First, the clown I had hired. Rebecca had researched online and found negative reviews, including one mother who said her son was scared. Rebecca insisted that clowns were inappropriate for modern children and that she had already hired a replacement, an entertainer specializing in princess parties who cost $600. She expected me to pay for the new entertainer since I had offered to pay for the entertainment. Next came the cake. Rebecca decided the cake I'd ordered was too sugary and had artificial colors. She'd found an organic bakery specializing in low-sugar cakes with natural ingredients. She'd already ordered a cake from there for $550, again expecting me to pay. Then came the party favors. Rebecca reviewed every item I'd purchased and found problems with almost all of them. The plastic toys were bad for the environment. The candy was too sugary. The plastic princess tiaras were made in China and possibly toxic. She had an alternative list of eco-friendly and educational party favors that cost twice what I'd spent. I tried to politely explain that I had already invested a lot of money and time into planning the party, and that making all these changes would be financially difficult for me. Rebecca looked at me with that expression I was beginning to know well, a mixture of disappointment and barely concealed contempt. She said that if I truly loved Emma, I would want the best for her, not just what was most convenient or affordable for me. Those words stung deeply, questioning my love for my granddaughter simply because I had reasonable financial constraints. I ended up giving in to some of her demands, canceling the clown and paying for the more expensive entertainer, ordering the organic cake, and keeping the party favors I'd already prepared. In total, Rebecca's changes added another $1,200 to the party cost. But the extra expenses were just the beginning of the problems. On the day of the party, Rebecca arrived 4 hours early with a van full of extra decorations and a team of 3 professional decorators she had hired. They immediately began dismantling the decorations the decorator and I had spent 2 days putting up. When I protested that we had already decorated everything, Rebecca said my decorations were adorable but too amateurish for the photos she planned to take. She explained that she was hiring a professional photographer to document the party and needed everything to look perfect for her event planning portfolio, as she was considering throwing children's parties as a lucrative hobby. I watched helplessly as my carefully placed decorations were dismantled and replaced with more sophisticated and expensive arrangements. Rebecca's decorators worked quickly, transforming my garden from a charming childhood wonderland into something more like a magazine spread. It was beautiful, I admit, but it had lost the warmth and personal touch I had put into my decorations. My homemade bunting was replaced with custom silk bunting. My simple balloons were replaced with elaborate balloon arrangements in the form of arches and columns. My modest sound system was replaced with professional speakers. During the party, I found myself reduced to a helper role. Rebecca constantly directed me, asking me to fetch more drinks from the kitchen, clean up spills, handle the visiting mother's bags, cut more cake, and pick up used dishes. I barely had time to interact with Emma or the other children because I was constantly rushing to meet Rebecca's demands. The guests naturally gravitated toward Rebecca, who was charismatic and engaging, while I was seen as the helper working behind the scenes. When it came time to sing happy birthday and take the official photo around the cake, Rebecca carefully arranged all the family members for the perfect composition. She positioned herself and David directly behind Emma, with Lucas at her side. Rebecca's parents were placed on the right, her sister Sarah and her husband on the left. There was a clearly designated space for each person, and when I stepped forward to join the group, Rebecca held up a hand and said, "Hold on, Margaret, we already have too many people in the frame. You can take a separate photo with Emma later, okay?" I stood there, holding the gifts I'd brought for Emma, my 3 carefully chosen gifts that together cost $400, watching my family pose for a photo in which I was explicitly excluded. Emma saw me standing there and yelled, "Grandma, come here." But Rebecca quickly distracted her, saying, "Look at the camera, honey, smile big for the photographer." The photographer took dozens of photos, each one capturing a perfect family moment in which I wasn't a part. The private photo with Emma that Rebecca promised never happened. Immediately after the group photo, the kids were taken to an activity, and Rebecca was busy being the perfect hostess. When the party ended and the guests left, Rebecca and David rushed out, saying Emma was tired and needed to go home to rest. They took all the gifts, including mine, and left in less than 10 minutes, leaving me alone with a messy house and a broken heart. I spent that night alone cleaning up after the party, throwing away expensive decorations that couldn't be reused, and storing dirty dishes that would take hours to wash. I looked at the photos on my phone, the few I managed to take during the party, and realized I barely appeared in any of them. I'd spent over $4,000 and countless hours of work, and all I had to show for it were a few blurry photos of me in the background carrying dishes or cleaning tables. 2 days later, Rebecca posted a professional photo album of the party on Facebook and Instagram. The photos were stunning, showcasing every detail of the elaborate decor, capturing beautiful moments of Emma playing with friends, and perfectly composed family portraits. Rebecca credited herself with the planning and execution of the party, mentioning how hard she worked to create a magical day for her daughter. There was no mention of me, the fact that the party was held at my house, or that I paid for most of it. It was as if I didn't exist. The comments on the post were abundant, dozens of Rebecca's friends praising her event planning skills, telling her she should definitely start a business, that they would hire her for their own children's parties. Rebecca responded graciously to each comment, absorbing the compliments without any acknowledgement that it wasn't entirely her doing. David liked the post but didn't comment to correct the narrative or credit me. That hurt more than anything Rebecca could have done. After that incident, I began to notice a disturbing pattern. Rebecca was systematically erasing me from important moments in my grandchildren's lives and rewriting the narrative to place herself at the center of everything. I discovered through Facebook that Emma had participated in a spring performance at her school, a lovely event where the children sang songs and presented art projects they had created. There were photos of Rebecca's entire family there, including her parents, who had driven all the way from Portland especially for the event. I had no idea the performance was happening. When I asked David why I hadn't been informed, he seemed genuinely confused and said he was sure Rebecca had told me. He picked up his phone and texted Rebecca in front of me, asking if she had invited me. Her reply came quickly, saying, "Of course I had. I emailed Margaret weeks ago with all the details." I never received that email. I checked my inbox, my spam folder, everything. There was no email from Rebecca about the presentation. When I mentioned this to David, he looked uncomfortable and said that perhaps the email hadn't been delivered due to a technical issue. He asked me not to make a big deal about it, that there were other presentations in the future and he would personally let me know about them. But I could see in his eyes that he knew something was wrong, that Rebecca probably hadn't sent me the email, but he wasn't about to confront her about it. This pattern continued for the next 2 years. Important events would happen, and I'd find out about them after the fact through social media. Lucas's first day of preschool, photographed and posted without me knowing he was starting school. Emma's dance recital, where she was the flower in a production of The Nutcracker, with beautiful photos of her in her costume that I never got to see in person. A family trip to Disneyland during spring break, documented in excruciating detail online while I sat at home thinking they were just too busy to call me. Each discovery felt like a stab in the heart. It wasn't just that I was missing these moments, it was the implicit lie behind each exclusion. Rebecca wasn't simply forgetting to notify me about events. She was actively excluding me while making sure to include her own family in every moment. Rebecca's parents saw my grandchildren regularly, sometimes several times a month, while I was lucky to see them once every 6 weeks. I tried to talk to David about it more seriously. I arranged a lunch with him, just the two of us, at a quiet Italian restaurant he used to love. I waited until we finished eating, and then gently but firmly expressed my concerns. I told him about all the events I'd missed, about how painful it was to find out about important moments through social media, about how I felt increasingly like an outsider in my own grandchildren's lives. David listened, his face showing growing discomfort. When I finished, he sighed deeply and said something that completely shocked me. He said Rebecca had spoken to him about me, that she was worried I was becoming too intrusive in their lives. According to Rebecca, I called excessively frequently, showed up unannounced, made critical comments about their parenting choices, and generally didn't respect their boundaries as a family. I was flabbergasted. I never showed up unannounced, always scheduling visits in advance. I didn't call too often, maybe once a week at best, and David usually didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. As for critical comments, the only time I expressed a dissenting opinion was when Rebecca wanted to put Emma on a strict vegan diet at age 4 without consulting a pediatrician, and I gently suggested it would be prudent to get medical advice first. That one instance of soliciting advice had been twisted into a narrative where I was the controlling mother-in-law constantly criticizing. I tried to explain this to David, trying to make him see that Rebecca was distorting reality, but he cut me off. He said Rebecca had no reason to lie about it, that she was just trying to protect her family from unhealthy interference. He asked me to give them more space, to let Rebecca lead when it came to the kids, to wait to be invited in instead of asking to participate. He said that if I backed off and respected their boundaries, eventually Rebecca would feel more comfortable and I would be included more. I left that lunch feeling completely devastated and questioning my own sanity. Had I truly been intrusive without realizing it? Had my attempts to help been perceived as interference? I spent days replaying every interaction, every conversation, every offer of help, trying to understand where I had gone wrong. I spoke to friends who were also grandmothers, and they all assured me that my behavior had been completely normal and appropriate, that I wasn't being intrusive in any way. But even with my friends' validation, the doubt persisted. And so I did what David had asked. I withdrew completely. I stopped calling except on specific occasions like birthdays. I stopped asking to see the kids, hoping to be invited. I stopped offering help, no matter how much I wanted it. Basically, I remained passive, waiting for Rebecca to make the first move to include me. The result was devastating. Weeks passed without any contact. The first month after that conversation with David, I didn't see my grandchildren even once. The second month, there was a visit, but only because it was Lucas's birthday, and it would obviously be strange not to invite me to my own grandson's birthday party. The party was at an indoor amusement park, with dozens of screaming children, and I barely managed to have a real conversation with Lucas amidst all the activities and chaos. In the third month, nothing. No calls, no visits, no messages. I saw photos of Emma and Lucas growing up on Facebook, changing and reaching milestones without me. Emma lost another tooth, and I found out from a photo where she was smiling, showing off her space. Lucas learned to tie his own shoes, and I saw a video of him proudly demonstrating his new skill. Each milestone was a painful reminder that I was missing out on their childhood, a precious time I could never get back. My friends encouraged me to take a stronger stand, to demand my rights as a grandmother, but I was afraid. Afraid of completely alienating David. Afraid that Rebecca would make it even harder for me to see the children. Afraid of causing a conflict that could harm Emma and Lucas. So I kept waiting for some sign that Rebecca was willing to include me again. Mother's Day that year was particularly painful. I woke up that Sunday morning expecting at least a call from David, maybe a quick visit from the kids. David had told me a few days earlier that they had plans with Rebecca's family, an elaborate brunch Rebecca was organizing for her mother, so I didn't expect to see them during the day. But I expected a call. I expected Emma and Lucas to at least say Happy Mother's Day. The entire day passed without a call. I sat in my living room, staring at my phone, jumping every time it rang, only to discover it was a robocall or a friend. At 7 o'clock that night, I finally received a text from David. Just text, no voice or video call. The message simply said, Happy Mother's Day, Mom. The kids send their love. No photos, no messages from the kids themselves, just those few sterile words. I cried so much that night that my eyes were puffy and red the next day. I felt completely forgotten and unappreciated. 2 days later, I went on Facebook and saw that Rebecca had posted a huge album of the Mother's Day brunch she had organized for her mother, Susan. There were photos of a beautifully set table with fresh flowers and fine china. Photos of a radiant Susan surrounded by her daughters and grandchildren. Photos of Emma and Lucas holding handmade, "I love you, Grandma Susan" signs with hearts and glitter. Photos of expensive gifts being opened, including a pearl necklace that must have cost at least $1,000. Seeing those photos was like being stabbed repeatedly. My own grandchildren had spent Mother's Day celebrating another grandmother with so much love and affection, while I hadn't even received a phone call. Rebecca had posted a long caption about how Susan was the best mother and grandmother in the world, how she had sacrificed so much for her daughters, how every mother deserved to be celebrated and appreciated. The hypocrisy was staggering considering she had ensured I spent Mother's Day completely alone. It was at that moment that I began to feel not only sadness, but anger. Anger for allowing myself to be treated this way. Anger for having passively accepted the narrative that I was the problem. Anger for having allowed Rebecca to turn me into a peripheral presence in my grandchildren's lives. But even with that anger, I didn't know what to do. I felt helpless, caught between my desire to be close to the children and the fear of causing a conflict that could cut me off from them completely. I tried mailing Emma and Lucas gifts. I spent hours in stores choosing toys I knew they would love. For Emma, who was obsessed with science and experiments, I bought a children's chemistry set that cost $80. For Lucas, who loved building things, I bought an elaborate Lego set that cost $120. I wrote long, loving cards to each of them, telling them how much I loved and missed them. I paid for express shipping to ensure the packages arrived quickly. I never received confirmation that the gifts were delivered, even though the tracking showed they were. No thank you call from David. No photos of the kids with the toys. No messages. It was as if the gifts had disappeared into a black hole. 2 weeks later, I texted David asking if the kids had received the packages. He simply replied, "Yes, they did, and thank you." When I asked if they liked them, he said yes, they really liked them. But no photos, no details, no real connection. After 5 months of painful estrangement, I finally begged David to see the kids. I called in tears, saying I couldn't take it anymore, that I needed to see my grandchildren, that I was willing to accept any conditions Rebecca set. David sighed heavily and said he would talk to Rebecca. 3 days of agonizing waiting later, he called me back saying I could come over for dinner the following Saturday. There were rules. No gifts for the kids because Rebecca didn't want them spoiled, no comments about parenting choices, and only 2 hours to avoid disrupting the children's sleep routine. I agreed to everything. She was so desperate to see Emma and Lucas that she would have agreed to anything. That Saturday, I put on my best outfit, carefully choosing to be presentable but not too formal. I bought an expensive wine to take to David and Rebecca, since I couldn't bring gifts for the children. I drove the 40 minutes to their house with my heart pounding, nervous as if I were going to a job interview instead of visiting my own family. When I rang the doorbell, Lucas opened the door and shouted, "Grandma," with genuine joy. He threw himself into my arms, and I hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo in his hair. Emma appeared right behind him, more reserved but clearly happy to see me. She hugged me and asked where I'd been, saying she'd missed me. Those simple words from a 6-year-old broke my heart. "I'd missed you, Grandma. Why wasn't I there?" What would I say? How would I explain that his mother was keeping me away without badmouthing Rebecca? Rebecca appeared and greeted me politely, but there was an unmistakable coldness in her eyes. She thanked me for the wine and immediately told me to sit in the living room while she finished preparing dinner. When I offered to help, she firmly declined, saying she had everything under control. So I sat with Emma and Lucas, finally able to actually speak to them for the first time in months. Emma told me about her art class at school, about how she had painted a portrait of our family, including me. She said she wanted to give it to me, but Mom said she was keeping it on the fridge. Lucas showed me some drawings he had made, cars and planes in vibrant colors. He had so much to tell, words pouring out of him about his friends, his favorite toys, a movie he had seen. I absorbed every word, every smile, every laugh, trying to commit these precious moments to memory. But after just 15 minutes, Rebecca came in and said it was time for dinner and the kids needed to wash their hands. She took them to the bathroom, leaving me alone in the living room. I looked around, noticing there were no photos of me with the kids anywhere. There were dozens of photos of Rebecca's family, including several of Susan with Emma and Lucas, but none of me. It was as if I'd been erased from the family's visual history. Dinner was tense. Rebecca had prepared an elaborate meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables and quinoa, clearly to showcase her culinary skills. The food was delicious, I admit, but the atmosphere was uncomfortable. Rebecca dominated the conversation, talking about her work, projects she was leading, and recognition she was receiving. David contributed occasionally, but mostly ate in silence. The children were well behaved but clearly feeling the tension. I tried asking questions about the children, their activities and interests, but Rebecca intercepted every question, answering for them or redirecting the conversation. When Emma started telling me about a science project she was working on, Rebecca interrupted her, saying, "Grandma doesn't want to hear about boring school stuff, honey." When Lucas tried to show me a new skill he'd learned, Rebecca said it wasn't the time to show off tricks at the dinner table. I served my own plate, noticing that Rebecca gave me tiny portions compared to what she served everyone else. My plate had perhaps a third of the food on their plates. When I looked at her questioningly, Rebecca smiled and said, "I thought you'd be watching your weight at your age, Margaret." The comment was delivered sweetly, but the hurtful intent was clear. I was in my early 60s, not overweight, but Rebecca was using my age as a weapon to shame me. Dinner lasted only 45 minutes. As soon as we finished, Rebecca immediately started cleaning up, refusing my help again. She said the kids had homework to finish and needed to start their bedtime routine soon. It was only 7 o'clock at night, far too early for even young children's bedtime routines, but Rebecca was adamant. She said I might come back another day, but her expression made it clear that was a polite lie. I hugged Emma and Lucas, holding them a little tighter and a little longer than usual, trying to absorb enough of them to last until the next time I could see them, whenever that might be. Emma whispered in my ear, "Can you come to my dance performance next week?" I looked at Rebecca questioningly, and she said, "Oh, yes, I was going to mention that. There's a performance at school, but it's probably too inconvenient for you to drive there on a weekday." I immediately said it wasn't a problem, that I'd love to go. Rebecca seemed disappointed but said she'd send me the details. I left that house with my heart torn between joy at seeing my grandchildren and utter sadness at how controlled and limited that interaction had been. I drove home with tears streaming down my face, wondering how long I could continue living this way, with scraps of time with my grandchildren meticulously doled out by the woman I increasingly saw as my adversary. I didn't receive any email about Emma's dance performance. 3 days before the date Emma had mentioned, I texted David asking about the details. He didn't respond for 24 hours, and when he did, he said the performance had been cancelled due to a venue issue. Later that day, I saw photos on Facebook of Emma in her dance costume, clearly after a performance. The performance hadn't been cancelled. I simply wasn't welcome. That blatant lie was a turning point for me. It was no longer about forgetfulness or misunderstandings. It was a deliberate lie to exclude me. I confronted David on the phone, my voice shaking with anger and pain. I told him I'd seen the photos, that I knew the performance had happened, that I knew he'd lied to me. David was silent for a long moment, and then admitted that Rebecca had decided it would be best for me not to go because there were limited seats and they needed to reserve seats for her family who were visiting. Her family. Her family always came first. I was always the one who could be sacrificed, discarded, lied to. I told David that what they were doing was cruel, that I didn't deserve to be treated that way, that I was tired of accepting excuses and justifications for behavior that was clearly disrespectful. David tried to calm me down, telling me that I was overreacting, that I was being too sensitive. That phrase, too sensitive, as if my legitimate feelings of pain and exclusion were just unnecessary drama on my part. I hung up the phone in a rage, something I had never done before with my son. Over the next few days, David tried calling several times, but I didn't answer. I needed space to process, to decide what to do next. My options seemed limited. I could continue to accept whatever time I was granted with my grandchildren, no matter how humiliating the process. I could walk away completely, an option that broke me just thinking about. Or I could fight, but how? I had no legal rights to my grandchildren. Rebecca and David, as parents, had complete control. It was during this difficult period that I began therapy. My therapist, a wise woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, helped me see the patterns in my behavior and Rebecca's. She helped me understand that I was in an emotionally abusive relationship with my daughter-in-law, characterized by manipulation, gaslighting, and control. She taught me about setting boundaries and maintaining my dignity even in difficult situations. Dr. Chen also gently pointed out that David, although I loved him deeply, was complicit in the abuse by allowing Rebecca to treat me that way and by not standing up for me. She helped me see that my son had become so controlled by Rebecca that he had lost his own voice and agency. Working with Dr. Chen gave me tools to cope, but it also made me realize how toxic the dynamic had become. Months passed with minimal contact. I saw Emma and Lucas briefly on Halloween when they came to my house trick-or-treating, a tradition Rebecca apparently couldn't find an excuse to deny me since we were on her planned route. I saw them again on Thanksgiving, but only because David insisted it would be too obviously wrong to exclude me completely from the holiday. The Thanksgiving visit was short and tense, with Rebecca complaining the entire time about having to drive 40 minutes to my house. And then Christmas arrived. 2 weeks before the holiday, David called me with the news that Rebecca had decided to have a small, intimate celebration with just her immediate family. When I asked if I wasn't considered immediate family, there was an uncomfortable silence on the line. David then explained that Rebecca meant her parents, her sister, and her family, plus the 4 of them. I wasn't on the list. The exclusion was so blatant, so obviously cruel, that I was momentarily speechless. David quickly continued, saying that perhaps I could drop by to drop off gifts later in the day. Not to celebrate with them, not to watch the children open presents or enjoy Christmas morning together, but simply to drop off gifts as a delivery person. I tried to argue, tried to make David see how wrong this was, but he was firm. Rebecca had made her decision, and that was the final decision. I hung up crying, feeling like I'd finally hit rock bottom. Being excluded from Christmas with my grandchildren felt like the ultimate insult, the ultimate rejection. I considered simply not going, not giving Rebecca the satisfaction of seeing me appear like a supplicant begging for scraps of time with my family. But my love for Emma and Lucas was stronger than my pride. I needed to see them, even if only for a few minutes, even in Rebecca's humiliating circumstances. I spent the next 2 weeks buying the perfect gifts for the children. For Emma, now 8 and increasingly interested in science, I bought a children's telescope that cost $300, along with astronomy books and a science experiment kit. For Lucas, 6 and obsessed with construction, I bought an elaborate Lego Technic set that cost $250, along with real, child-sized construction tools. I spent hours wrapping each gift perfectly, writing cards that expressed my love and longing for them. On Christmas morning, I woke early with a knot in my stomach. I put on my best outfit, a dark green dress I'd bought especially for the occasion, and applied my makeup carefully, wanting to look dignified despite how I was feeling inside. I loaded the presents into the car and drove those 40 minutes that now seemed to represent the emotional distance between me and my family. The radio played cheerful Christmas songs that contrasted cruelly with my sadness. I arrived at David and Rebecca's house at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, just as Rebecca had instructed. I could hear music and laughter coming from inside, the sounds of a family celebration in full swing. I took several deep breaths before ringing the doorbell, mentally preparing myself for whatever awaited me. Rebecca opened the door wearing a red designer dress that probably cost $1,000, holding a glass of red wine, her face perfectly made up, and her hair impeccably styled. She looked me up and down with that expression I'd learned to dread, a critical assessment I always found myself lacking somehow. She said, "Margaret, you're here early. We said after 6, not 5. I glanced at my phone in confusion, checking the text David had sent me. It clearly said 5 o'clock. I showed her the text, and she shrugged, saying there must have been a misunderstanding, but that I'd arrived at a very inconvenient time because they were taking family photos. Before I could respond, I heard Emma's high-pitched voice shout, "Grandma, Grandma's here." I saw my granddaughter running down the hall toward the door, wearing a lovely red dress with a white bow, her face alight with genuine joy. Rebecca quickly reached out, grabbing Emma by the shoulder and stopping her progress. She said in a firm but sweet voice, "Dear, Grandma's just dropping off your presents, she can't stay now." The confusion on Emma's face broke my heart. Lucas appeared behind her, wearing a festive Christmas sweater, also looking confused as to why I was at the door but not coming in. It was then that David appeared, holding an expensive professional camera, the kind that cost thousands of dollars and that I was sure they had bought with the money I still thought was only $25,000. He glanced at me but immediately looked away, his posture hunched and defeated. Rebecca turned to him and said excitedly, "David, let's set up for the big family photo in front of the tree." She began arranging everyone, calling out her parents, her sister Sarah, and her husband James, Sarah's 2 young children. I stood there in the doorway, still holding the wrapped gifts, watching everyone position themselves for the perfect family photo. The Christmas tree behind them was spectacular, at least 8 feet tall, professionally decorated with matching red and gold ornaments, perfectly spaced twinkling lights. Richard and Susan, Rebecca's parents, stood proudly in the center, surrounded by their grandchildren. Sarah and James stood on one side with their children. Rebecca and David stood on the other with Emma and Lucas. It was a perfect composition, each person positioned for maximum visual impact. For a brief, insane moment, I thought perhaps Rebecca would invite me into the photo now that everyone was gathered. I took a small step forward, and that was what triggered the moment that would change everything. Rebecca turned to me, her face transforming from a TV presenter's smile to a mask of genuine irritation. She pointed at me and said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "Turn that off, you're ruining everything." The word, that, as if I were an object, a defective thing that was ruining her perfect composition. Not Margaret, not her mother-in-law, not David's mother, but that. She literally made a shut-off gesture with her hand, as if she could erase me from existence with a simple movement. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room stopped and stared at me. Susan had an expression of satisfied superiority, as if this moment confirmed everything she'd ever believed about me. Richard looked uncomfortable but said nothing in my defense. Sarah had that mischievous smile again, clearly enjoying my embarrassment. Sarah's children looked confused. Emma and Lucas looked shocked and sad, their faces showing that even at their young ages, they understood something terrible was happening. And David, my son, the boy I raised to be kind and defend the weak, just stood there holding that expensive camera, staring at his expensive shoes, saying absolutely nothing while his wife humiliated me in front of her entire family. That moment of cowardice hurt more than all of Rebecca's cruelties combined. I could perhaps understand Rebecca hating me for reasons I didn't fully comprehend, but David? My own son letting me be treated like dirt? I stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. My arms still held the gifts I'd chosen so carefully, wrapped so lovingly. I could feel tears starting to prick my eyes, but I refused to give Rebecca the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. What do you say when your own daughter-in-law calls you that in front of the whole family? How do you respond to such a complete and public humiliation? Rebecca was already turning away, her attention returning to the photo setup as if I were just a minor inconvenience that had been addressed. She adjusted Emma's dress, smoothed Lucas's hair, checked everyone's positioning. Susan said something about the light being perfect now and they shouldn't waste it. David raised the camera into position, preparing to capture the perfect family moment from which I was so obviously left out. It was then that something inside me broke, or perhaps finally mended. All the pain, all the anger, all the humiliation of the past few years converged in that moment. But instead of collapsing or running away crying, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. I looked at that scene, really looked, and suddenly everything made sense. The systematic exclusion, the lie about the life insurance money, the way Rebecca controlled every aspect of David's life, how he had become a shadow of the man he used to be. I stepped back silently, stepping out the door. Rebecca didn't even notice, so focused was she on her perfect photo. I walked back to my car in a daze, put the gifts in the back seat, got into the driver's seat, and just stood there. Not crying yet, just processing. I started the car and drove a few blocks, then stopped on a quiet residential street. That's when the tears started, great sobs shaking my entire body. I cried for everything I had lost, for all the moments with my grandchildren I could never get back, for the son who had been manipulated into betraying me. I cried for maybe 15 minutes, until I had no more tears. And then, sitting in that car on an unfamiliar street on Christmas Day, something shifted. The sadness began to transform into something stronger, more focused. Anger, yes, but also determination. I was no longer going to accept this treatment. I was no longer going to be passive. I was no longer going to allow Rebecca to turn me into a helpless victim. If she wanted a war, she would have won, but it would be fought on my terms. I started the car and drove back to David and Rebecca's house. I didn't know exactly what I intended to do. I didn't have a formulated plan, but I knew I couldn't just drive away and let this be the last word. When I pulled up in front of the house again, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. Someone had probably gotten out to get something from the car or was taking out the trash. Through the crack, he could hear voices coming from the living room. Something made me pause instead of going straight to ring the doorbell. I stood outside the door, listening. What I heard in the next few minutes validated all my worst fears and suspicions, and gave me the information I needed to finally take a stand. It was Rebecca speaking to her sister Sarah, their voices audible through the half-open door because they were close to the entrance and speaking louder than they should have, probably a little tipsy from the Christmas wine. Rebecca said, "I finally got rid of her today. Did you see how easy it was? Just a few well-placed insults and she ran off like a beaten dog." Sarah laughed, a nasty, cruel sound, and said, "You're terrible, Becca, but I have to admit it was hilarious to see her face when you called her that." Rebecca laughed too and said, I know, I probably went too far, but God, she irritates me so much with that long-suffering martyr attitude. Always acting like she's the victim when she's just a boring old woman who can't accept she's no longer needed." My heart was pounding so hard I thought they could hear it. I grabbed my phone and silently opened the voice recording app, hitting record. I needed to capture this, whatever else was said. Sarah said something about me finding out about the inheritance money, her voice too low for me to hear clearly. Rebecca responded louder, "You don't understand, Sarah, this house, the renovations, the investments, everything is technically in David's name, but I control it all. He's so manipulable that I practically have power of attorney over every penny he earns. The last thing I need is that old hag finding out how much money we really have and coming to ask for a cut or expecting us to share with her." Sarah asked, "But what if she finds out about the life insurance? Do you really think David can keep up the lie forever?" Rebecca let out a confident laugh and said, "That idiot doesn't even know we received $250,000 yet. She actually believed David when he said it was only $25,000 to cover the funeral expenses. She's so pathetic and naive she didn't even question it. And even if she finds out now, what will she do? Threaten to sue her own son? She loves us too much for that, or at least loves David and the kids too much. She'll swallow this betrayal like she swallowed all the others." My hand shook as I held the phone, but I held on tight, making sure every word was captured. Rebecca continued, "And best of all, I managed to convince David to put almost all of his money into investment accounts that only I have access to. Technically, David is still the account holder, but I have the password, I make all the transactions, I control everything. If she finds out and tries something illegal, she won't find anything easily accessible. It will take months of financial investigation, and during that time I can move funds, hide assets. I've worked in marketing long enough to know people who know people, if you know what I mean." Sarah said, "You've really thought of everything, haven't you? And when the old lady dies, I bet whatever she leaves will come straight to you too." Rebecca answered exactly, and God knows she must have a decent amount saved from that teacher's pension and the house that's completely paid off. When she dies, and I honestly hope it's sooner rather than later because she's a constant pain in my existence, everything will come to David as his only son. And what's David's is essentially mine. I'm just playing the long game here, Sarah. Keep the old lady at arm's length so she can't interfere or find out, but not so far away that David starts questioning what I'm doing. Sarah asked David, doesn't he really realize how you manipulate him? He seems so completely under your control. Rebecca said, David is fundamentally weak, always has been. Why do you think I married him? He had a good job, came from a respectable family, was handsome enough, and most importantly, he was easily manipulated. Men like David, who were raised by overprotective mothers who did everything for them, are simply looking for another woman to take on that role. I became indispensable to him so quickly that he didn't even notice. I manage his finances, choose his clothes, make all the important decisions, and he just goes along with it because it's easier than having a backbone. I couldn't breathe. Hearing my son described that way, hearing the woman he loved speak of him with such contempt, was almost worse than hearing about the financial manipulation. Rebecca continued, as for the children, well, they're adorable and helpful in keeping David in line. Whenever he starts to question something or shows signs of growing a spine, I simply have to suggest that I might make it harder for him to see the kids if we separate. He immediately recoils. I've researched custody laws, found an aggressive divorce attorney, documented every time he worked late or missed a school event. If I need to, I can paint a picture of him as an absent and neglectful father, and with my resources and connections, I can ensure I have primary custody. David knows this on some level, so he doesn't risk it. Sarah said you're scary, you know that, right? But also kind of brilliant in a Machiavellian way. Rebecca laughed and said, I have to be strategic, Sarah. The world doesn't give women anything for free. We have to take what we want, and I want financial security, a nice house, well-behaved children, and a comfortable life. If that means manipulating a weak man and keeping an annoying mother-in-law at bay, then so be it. No regrets, no guilt. This is the life I've built, and I'll protect it by any means necessary. Just then, their mother, Susan, called from the living room, saying it was time to open presents, and Rebecca and Sarah began to move. I quickly moved away from the door, silently running back to my car. I sat in the driver's seat, my heart pounding, stopped the recording, and immediately emailed the audio file to myself and a trusted friend, Jane Morrison, a retired lawyer. I wrote a line in the message. Jane, I need your help urgently. Please keep this recording safe and do not delete it. I will explain everything tomorrow. So I just sat there for a moment, processing everything I'd heard. $250,000, not $25,000. Rebecca had complete control of David's finances without him really understanding. She was actively plotting how to keep him trapped in the marriage by threatening to take the children away. She was waiting for me to die so she could access whatever I left behind. She saw my son as weak and easily manipulated. She had no remorse, no empathy, only cold calculation about how to use people to get what she wanted. With that recording safely tucked away, I returned to the front door. This time, I didn't eavesdrop. I walked straight in, opening the door wide enough to slip through. Rebecca was back in the living room, holding Lucas as he opened a present. When she saw me, her face went white. She knew from the look on my face that something had changed. She could sense the power had shifted. I walked straight into the middle of the room, my presence interrupting the cozy scene of gift opening. David stood up in alarm, saying, Mom, what are you doing here? You said you were going home. I looked at him and said in a calm but firm voice, David, we need to talk now. This isn't a request. It's a demand. You have 2 minutes to decide whether you want to have this conversation privately in your office or in front of everyone gathered here. But we're going to have this conversation, and it's going to be now. The tone of my voice must have communicated something because David didn't argue. He looked at Rebecca as he did whenever he needed permission or guidance, but this time I cut him off. Don't look at her, David. Look at me. I'm your mother, and I'm going to have a talk with my son right now. Rebecca stood, her mouth opening to protest, but I silenced her with a look. And you, Rebecca, will stay right where you are and be quiet while I talk to David. Unless you want me to tell everyone in this room exactly what I heard you say to your sister 10 minutes ago. I saw panic cross Rebecca's face. Sarah also paled, realizing her conversation had been overheard. Susan tried to intervene, saying something about me being rude and dramatic, but Richard silenced her with a touch on her arm. I think he could sense something serious was going on and had enough sense not to interfere. David led me to his office, his face showing confusion and growing concern. As soon as the office door closed behind us, I turned to David and said bluntly, "I need you to tell me about your father's life insurance. How much money did you receive?" I saw the color drain from his face. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Before he could formulate a lie, I continued, "I know, David. I know it wasn't $25,000. I know it was much more. I know Rebecca has control over her finances. I know everything. So don't lie to me anymore. Don't protect her. Tell me the truth now." David collapsed in his office chair, his body hunched over as if physically struck. Tears streamed down his face, and he put his head in his hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and filled with shame. He whispered, "It was $250,000. I heard the number aloud, confirmed by my own son, and even though I already knew it, it was still a shock. $250,000 that he and Rebecca had hidden from me, lying about the inheritance my husband had left. I asked why. Why lie to me? Why hide so much money?" David cried harder and said, "Rebecca, she said it would be better not to tell you, that you might get upset or feel like you should have some of the money. She said it would be simpler, less complicated, if we just kept it private. And I, God help me, believed her. I was grieving, I was confused, and she seemed so right about everything. She always seems so right about everything. I asked where the money was now." David rubbed his weary face and explained that $50,000 had been used as a down payment on the house, $50,000 for renovations, and the rest was in various investment accounts. When I asked who had access to these accounts, he hesitated before admitting that Rebecca managed everything. He was technically the account holder, but she had all the passwords, made all the transactions, and made all the decisions. He didn't even know exactly where all the money was currently or how much it had grown or shrunk. I looked at my son, this successful and intelligent 35-year-old man, and saw how completely Rebecca had controlled him. I asked him why he allowed this, why he let me be treated that way for years, why he never stood up for me. David cried even harder and said that Rebecca always threatened to take the children away from him if he didn't do what she wanted. She said she had evidence of him being a negligent father by working long hours, that no judge would give him custody, that he would lose Emma and Lucas if he chose me over her. Those words confirmed everything I had heard on the recording. I told David we had to go back to that room now and that he needed to take a stand for the first time in years. We returned together, and I found Rebecca standing there, visibly nervous. I looked at her and said loudly for everyone to hear, "I have a recording of you admitting that you hid $250,000 from me, that you manipulate my son financially, that you plan to keep me away from my grandchildren, and that you are waiting for me to die so you can take my inheritance." I took out my phone and showed him the audio file, saying I had already sent copies to people I trusted. Rebecca tried to snatch my phone, but I quickly pushed it away. David, to my surprise, finally found his voice and said, "Rebecca, you need to leave this house now." Rebecca was shocked, arguing that it was her house, but David, with a firmness I hadn't seen in years, said, "The house is in my name, and I want you out immediately." Rebecca exploded in fury, shouting insults, but David grabbed the phone and threatened to call the police. Finally, Rebecca stormed off with her family, shouting threats as she left. The following months were legally complicated. I hired a lawyer, and the investigation revealed even more extensive financial manipulation. David filed for divorce, and the custody battle was intense, but the recording was crucial. The judge granted David primary custody and ordered Rebecca to return $120,000 of the misused funds. Rebecca was ordered to pay child support and legal fees. The judge also upheld my rights to see my grandchildren, declaring that I had been wrongfully alienated. Today, 3 years later, life is different but better. David is in a healthy relationship with a wonderful woman named Jennifer who respects me. Emma and Lucas are flourishing, and I see them regularly. That terrible Christmas was the turning point that forced me to fight for my dignity and my place in the family. I learned that true love sometimes means setting firm boundaries and that you teach people how to treat you. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments if you've ever faced anything similar. Thank you for listening to my journey from pain to empowerment.